Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So today I'm joined by Gary Carter. Gary, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
Gary is an old friend of mine, an old teacher of mine. I've known you for nearly 10 years now. Longer than that. Wow. And famous for his yoga, of course. He's one of the UK's top yoga teachers. And particularly your anatomy skills are famous. Actually, another very senior yoga teacher I was in his class the other day actually called you the most anatomically trained yoga teacher in the UK. That was how someone else described you.
Well, I wouldn't quite say that. But
you're an expert in fascia. You do dissections. You've got a background in martial arts as well as yoga. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I'd like to hear how you got into this body stuff in the first place. What was your route into this? Through sports? How did you get into it?
It's probably judo.
Judo
was the first thing, yeah. So I think that's one of the first kind of contact activities that had me sort of in touch with other bodies in that way. I mean, I played a bit of football and stuff like that, but I was never really someone for football teams. I could play, I could do okay, but just wasn't my thing. And I didn't kind of gel with big team sports like that. And my dad was always running football teams and coaching.
He still runs, doesn't he?
He still runs as well. So yeah, I'll talk about that later. But because he was involved in this process. But no, judo was an interesting thing. So I started that when I was young, so I think I must have been about 11 or 12. And the thing that really intrigued me was groundwork stuff and then how we were trained. And it was in our local youth club, but there was a guy there that had a club there and a club in North London. It's just that he lived in the village that I grew up in, so he wanted to try and set something up.
So you were a kid at this point?
Yeah, I was a kid at this point. And it just got me thinking in different ways and also having to manage somebody else's body weight, because we were paired up with somebody else, but sometimes we were paired up with someone a few years older and they were bigger and taller and all that kind of stuff and heavier, and I wasn't particularly big and I wasn't necessarily strong. And we had to learn ways to use our body to, have that person fly over my shoulder and stuff like that. And then learn to fall, learn to roll. So there's similarities in a way that you kind of come across in things like Aikido. The groundwork was interesting to me, how we use the ground and what we did with somebody, how we give our weight away. So they were great skills. And it was my father noticed in one of the competitions at the time that I wasn't as strong as I could be. So he dusted off his old weights that he had in his garage and we cleaned them all up, got rid of the rust and all that sort of stuff. And he just started showing me some very basic moves to generate some simple body strength. And I noticed that was working for me. I didn't kind of hang on with the judo thing very long, because I really, cycling was something that really got me. And I got into cycling in a big way and I was going to become pro. So I wanted to race seriously, and there was a team that was going to go down that route. We had some really interesting coaches. I learned a lot about me, my body, how it moved and how it felt. It was my descriptions of what I was feeling couldn't be understood by the people that were coaching me. That was something
because they were more mechanistic, or because you had some sort of internal sense?
I had an internal sense of something. I mean, I did a lot of athletics at school, and even when it came to training and working with people that I would train with, when we were running, if we just go out running and stuff like that, I would sort of describe certain sensations that were going on for me, and I found it really hard to get the right words for it because it didn't fit what I might come across as all the basic understandings of what a body might be in those days. I mean, there wasn't the kind of anatomy education in those days that we have now. I say that, although I think a lot of people were tuned into it a lot more than we've seen nowadays.
So we'll definitely come to that. We'll definitely come to anatomy in the modern world. And you got quite into bodybuilding, though, didn't you?
Yeah, so I was racing a lot. We had a coach that taught us about it wasn't about stretching, it was elasticity training. So it wasn't about stretching, elasticity of the spine and elasticity of the legs. So that kind of stayed with me as a teenager and into my late teens. And I had a nasty crash that stopped me from riding, so I kind of missed my slot to kind of go down the route that I wanted to go down. And I couldn't get on a bike for a while. And I started lifting weights again. That was the only thing I could do, really. I was seriously concussed for a long time and couldn't sit on a saddle. Accident was bad. So to do something with my body again, and I was used to moving, I started training and got into weight training a lot. And it was a friend of mine that gave me a book, and it was called Education of a Bodybuilder. Mm-hmm. And it was written by Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Wow.
And he was 25 when he wrote this. And he retired from pro bodybuilding at that time. And at that point, he was the world's greatest bodybuilder. And this was in the 70s at some point. I mean, I got handed this book about 1979, 80 or something. And I was intrigued. I was captivated just through this guy's journey and the mind and the use of the mind within the training. And the fact that physique could be changed and sculpted year in, year out to whatever shape you wanted it.
Yeah, I've seen some pictures of you looking very, very buff from those. So you've been lifting weights for as long as I've been alive.
Probably, yeah.
That's 79, 80. Yeah. And, it's interesting for me, you were doing sports, judo, cycling, and then weightlifting, but we're seeing the other side of it.
Yeah.
And actually, Schwarzenegger, he's now kind of known sort of slightly comically as Republican governor or whatever he's doing these days, was actually quite deep on some of this stuff in terms of the body and the mind.
Oh, totally, yeah. So, he would talk about visualization techniques, breath practices, meditation, all that kind of stuff. And he was also talking about it in a holistic way. So that, say, for instance, in a very simplistic way, is that if he had to change the shape of his calves because they didn't blend with the balance of the rest of his body, he had to train the rest of the body to work for that and with that. So they had to match and balance with, say, the shoulders and the neck. And, everything was an artistic endeavor. It was sculpting, right behind you. I'm looking at you right now and I can see Leonardo da Vinci's illustration.
Yeah, from Florence. I was just in Florence. That's where I picked that up.
It's one of my favourite places. And, and Statue of David, one of my favourite pieces, because I love Michelangelo's work. And these guys would sculpt their bodies that way. So they would look at the dynamics of the body and how it fell, or your eye fell on it. Nowadays, it's not like that. On one of my slideshows, I have that. I just did this weekend. So I showed some bodybuilder images from the 40s, 50s, through the 70s.
Become somewhat grotesque, haven't they?
And then now.
Yeah.
And there's this vast difference. And of course, when I show these images, my students, they kind of go, ugh. And then they see the next one, they go, ugh. And they see the last one, they go, wow, that's too much.
Yeah.
Then I show the first one and they go, oh, that's just athletic.
Yeah.
So, the eyes have got used to something and we've kind of got used to something. But now that world is a circus act.
Yeah.
But there was a guy that influenced me a lot, a guy called Frank Zane, and a guy called Vince Gironda. And they really did sculpt their structure. And they were constantly talking about feel. What was the quality of feel? And one of these guys was talking about writing a book, and the book was going to be called Feel. And that was it. And it's, what's the feel of the work? It's got nothing to do with just trying to throw weights around and build these muscles as big as possible. It's also got to function well and work well in your life. But I don't really see that happening.
Yeah. I mean, we've got loads of juicy topics here. So the kind of the mind side of more Western pursuits, it might, I can imagine someone listening to this who may have a kind of more esoteric Eastern background, not realizing that bodybuilding had this other side to it, or cycling or whatever it is, and how that can open up for people. Also this aesthetic side, you're an aesthetic guy. You look good. You dress well. You're in pretty good shape for an old man. Still to this day, Gary. But you're a beautiful man. I remember being at your wedding, and everything was aesthetically beautiful. And you and your wife both value that as, but in a kind of depth way, not in a kind of shallow. Body beautiful, you have to look like the magazines, you have to look skinny so men like you, or a lot of us are really sick of that in the world, and I imagine many listeners too. What would be a depth approach to the aesthetics of the body? So not just you know what I mean by that, not just like you have to look pretty.
I'm just going to backtrack because you're talking about the wedding thing. It just dropped me back into Charles Rennie Mackintosh. You heard of him? So he's a designer. I worked as a designer. So in the years that I was training, I was a graphic designer. And I got my father to thank for that, because he was an artist. And, he understood how shape worked on pages, and he could illustrate really well. He's also a good designer and engineer. And I always appreciated that. So it was in my eye all the time. I eventually got involved in more 3D graphics, which was model making before computers were around.
3D graphics.
Yeah, exactly.
The body,
And Charles Rennie Mackintosh, there's the Mackintosh Museum in Glasgow. If you go there, it's amazing, because his vision was about creating an environment for people to live in. So everything looks a certain way. It was designed a certain way, down to the furniture, the carpet, the wallpaper, the lights. even then how the typography fitted into books and stuff like that, but it actually had the person feel a certain way about their environment. So then they took care about how they appeared in that environment. And we kind of, you drop back into the 40s and it was, people wearing hats and coats and suits.
Yeah, it was the norm, wasn't it? For men
but the architecture of the environment was also matching their fashion.
Okay.
So everything kind of blended. I mean, I know that there's shit places and stuff like that as well, but it seemed to look more, it kind of all went together. And it's kind of interesting because around about that era, we've got the beginnings of someone like Joseph Pilates' work, and you've got Feldenkrais's work, and you've got Alexander's work, and you've kind of got a kind of a body culture beginning to occur. And there was Mabel Todd's work as well, Eokinesis, where all of that kind of disappeared. We got the wartime to thank for that, and kind of got rid of all of that stuff. And of course, a lot of cities and buildings were destroyed.
And they were built rebuilt very functionally in this kind of modernist, kind of ugly ways. The sort of the communist buildings I see in Russia, or the 1960s tower blocks in London.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, and also, within my graphics world, I ended up working within fashion design and fashion graphics, really. So, something that came up within the bodybuilding world is that the guys that had a sort of an interesting balance to their physique, let's say there's symmetry. We know the body's not symmetrical, but what they would aim towards is symmetry. What Michelangelo did with the statue of David to maintain that balance of symmetry, because the first time that statue was unveiled, women fainted because it was the most beautiful thing they'd ever seen. And I was there looking at that.
I was expecting it to be kind of cheesy and like, touristy, and I've seen this a million times. And I was there and I had the same experience with the Taj Mahal in India. I was thinking, I've seen this on the front of every curry house in England. But to actually sit there and look at it, I mean, I was transfixed.
Yeah,
it really was breathless. So it's like, wow.
It really is. And, I was, there's almost, pardon the hippiness here.
Always welcome, guys. It's Brighton.
Yeah. There's an energy walking towards it because it's got a presence within in that little auditorium there. And what Michelangelo did is in his sculpting of that was to make the ankles, the knees, the wrists and the elbows just a touch smaller. So that where the limbs blend in, they've got a sweep and a shape to them. So it adds to its elegance.
Yeah.
He made the feet and the hands a little bit bigger. Now, I heard about this, but I couldn't quite see it when I was looking at it. And something that we used to learn to do in bodybuilding, when we had photographs taken of ourselves to understand where the weak points were and where things didn't flow, is we'd look at the image, and we'd do this in graphics as well, look at the photograph upside down. You see it very differently.
Okay.
So, of course, what I did, because I was there, and it was also there when I met Vanda Scaravelli. This is one of the reasons I was in one of these states where, working with Diane Long. Actually, it was after I met Vanda. I was working with Diane Long, and I went walking around because Diane mushed my brain up, and I just thought, what the hell is this yoga stuff?
For those that don't know, Vanda Scaravelli is a founder of a kind of school of yoga, if you will, that's kind of loosely followed by different people. That has how would you describe Scaravelli yoga and that lineage? Feeling based.
Yeah, it's a feeling, but I'll get to it though.
Okay,
I'll get to it because I was so lost in it. In fact, what I did just to try and understand something about gravity, I was looking at the statue of David, and I remembered this thing about photographs. And I just looked at the statue of David, stood up. There's a bunch of tourists all around me, and I looked at the image of the statue through my legs upside down.
Right.
And all of a sudden, I got it. I got what Da Vinci had done, Michelangelo had done, but I also got the effect of gravity because of the way that this thing was standing. And it was quite amazing. And I understood the elegance of this and this form and shape. So, that style is something that stayed with me all the way through my life, and that quality. And it's applied to everything. It's a feel. So when it comes to training, it's a feel. It's a quality within the feel. Natural bodies. That needed to have that when someone literally touched the first door handle.
Yes, and Natural Bodies was the center you set up. That's where I first met you. And there was mostly yoga, Scaravelli influence, but there was also some martial arts in there, some Wing Chun, some body weight. You were doing one-to-one myofascial stuff with people. We'll get to the bodywork you do as well. So that was all going on under the same place, but there was an aesthetic to it, wasn't there? Like the contra posture movement of David that it conveys. It's not like the square medieval pictures where everything's totally square. Here, there's a dynamism to it. Yeah. There's an elegance to it. And there's a use of proportion. And, I'm somewhat ashamed if you're watching this on YouTube by how messy my office is. And I've been increasingly dissatisfied with this space and going, okay, how do I make this more of a space that reflects how I want to be.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, you know, and that was something that was important for me, because I needed to know that when I was in that environment, say at the studio, is that was a place I wanted to be in 24/7.
Yeah.
I didn't want to leave it. It wasn't a place that was an office space. It wasn't a workspace. This was an extension of me. It was an extension of home, and I wanted people to feel welcome in that. So the moment they got through the door, they felt as if they were kind of hugged, you know, that they were brought into the environment, and it felt easy. You know, so the way we use color, the way we use the door handles and stuff like that, everything had a quality to it that wasn't just in your face. It was there, but it felt safe to be in.
And these things all affect embodiment, right? So like, even if you open a studio door handle and it's slightly wobbly because someone hasn't bothered to fix it, you're immediately getting an impact there, which even if it's not registering consciously, there's a subtle impact of, this place isn't well looked after. Yeah. Or the aesthetic being, you know, I was in the yoga studio just recently, which was 1920s clothes shop underneath, and they kept the same aesthetic in the yoga studio. Wow. And I actually really liked it.
Yeah, that's cool.
It was so nice from such a change from the sort of sterile, fake spirituality of, you know, with a Gandhi quote or an Om on the wall. This actually felt real, because the person that ran it, the yoga teacher, loved 1920s, 1930s clothes, and they had a brand that you kind of went into and you felt kind of classic and dignified. And then as soon as you're in the postures of yoga, you're in that classic dignified sense was already in the system.
Yeah, exactly. You almost feel like the body could go there straight away, because the environment's created the ease for it to do that. You know, we had one little, which I've still got, little gold Buddha head, which I just love it. That just sat on one little spot. But then we had some lovely images of Michelangelo's work and a couple of photographs of Vanda, because it was a respect to her. That was it. Nothing else that was relevant to what we might see sold in markets in India and places like that, you know, just for the hell of trying to get those deities in there for what, you know.
Yeah. So sort of sticking feathers up your ass and pretend you're a chicken.
Yeah, I've tried that many times. It still doesn't work. I even put the rubber glove on my head.
You tried the rubber glove too. So let's talk about yoga then, because you're, you know, would you even still call yourself a yoga teacher now? I mean, you're known as one of the top yoga teachers in the UK. You run courses all over the world. And yet you're quite different from what people might think of as a yoga teacher. Like your classes, I was in one a week ago, they're quite unconventional in some ways. So say a little bit about your yoga journey, like how it opened for you and then where you've developed that.
Yeah, it kind of, if I go way back, I kind of remember that I used to raiding the drawers in my mum and dad's bedroom, is that we had an extension built, and we had to go through the bedroom windows of my parents' bedroom into the extension. I used to like playing in that extension, but you know, sometimes the drawers would fall open and stuff like that. But it was one of these really old Richard Hillman thin books, Yoga for Health or something like that. And there was these sort of drawings and photographs of women in green leotards. And
my mum had those too.
Yeah, and I was just quite intrigued by it. However, the way it was shown was just pretty much that it was just the thing that your mum did. You know, that's what I saw. But I was quite intrigued by all these movements. But there wasn't. I didn't kind of read too much at the beginning, and it didn't really have too much about philosophy and where it came from. And I probably at that age wouldn't even understood what I was reading anyway. So that was, you know, something that it's somewhere lodged in the back of my mind. And some of the movements I recognized when it came to doing all the stuff that we did with our trainers in cycling and the sort of I'll say elasticity work, stretching. But then, you know, I jumped forwards to, let's say, Brighton, really. It was, I was involved with a girl for quite some time that was studying to be a Pilates teacher, and she came from a dance and a fine art background. And she had the same kind of aesthetic about her as well. So, you know, that we already had that kind of blend. And through my time of bodybuilding, because I was getting ready to compete in bodybuilding, and I'll go through that story a little bit later, she was an apprentice to become a Pilates teacher to a studio in London. There was no Pilates studios in Brighton whatsoever. And she set up the first one, and it was in a flat. And
this is before the sort of yoga boom, right? Yeah, you were into yoga way before.
Yeah, Brighton was a shiatsu place at that time.
Okay.
You know, because it was hot. You know, I studied as a shiatsu practitioner, and pretty much everyone you walk down the street would be a shiatsu practitioner.
Yeah, there's two Alexander Technique schools here, and there's the National Feldenkrais School just up the road in Lewis.
Yeah.
But it wasn't always a yoga hub, was it? And
it had an Iyengar center here, one of the main Iyengar schools here, I think, in the 1960s, maybe the 70s. Someone out there will correct me on this. But when I was first here, it was Natural Health Center. That was the main place. And then I think evolution had just about started. And there's Buddhist Center was always here. However, so Martine was her name, and I became the guinea pig because we found that what she was doing and what she suggested was that the stuff that she was studying through the Pilates was quite similar to how we were going about the bodybuilding training, because there was a mindful quality to it. It was a meditative approach to training, and that's how we advertised it in the end. And it was her that gave me the book, or brought home the book, Awakening the Spine. Mm-hmm. Now, she was an apprentice, so it was every day for 2 years.
That's Scaravelli's classic.
Yeah.
Still worth
It's the seminal piece of work. Yeah. And I didn't know what it was. I just thought, I said, another Pilates book, because what I understood and the way I was taught and the education that was around in those days is that Pilates was about lengthening the spine. Contrology, it was the control of the movement of the body. And nothing to do with this thing called core stability, which is not very good anyway. It was more about central spine stuff. So I was quite intrigued by that. Anyway, we split up at some point, and then when I found out it was yoga, I thought, well, maybe I'm going to try and find out what this stuff's about. And I ended up going with a friend of mine who was an exercise and music teacher, a girl called Gabby, who I studied shiatsu with as well. And we ended up going to these Iyengar classes. And yeah, it was interesting. My body changed really quick, funnily enough. It was only 6 months, and I was probably going once a week. And it was very similar to everything that I'd learned when I was a teenager with this coach in cycling. Mm-hmm. Apart from, names of things and stuff like that. I had no idea. I was looking at the woman would create, say a name in the room, and I'd look around and know what she was talking about and copy everyone else. And I'll never forget, I was at a Christmas party back at my family's house, and I was chatting to a colleague of my dad's, and I remember standing a certain way. I had a feel of something. So this person's talking to me, and I must have looked as if I'd zoned out, because I actually felt as if it was I was like one of these water divining rods on the gravity line, and I felt so in the center of me in standing. And the only thing that came to my mind as this guy was talking to me was that this is that bloody yoga stuff I'm doing. It literally pulled me into a particular place. However, I was moving through my spine a particular way, and based on how I've been taught in the Pilates work. And this teacher came up to me as I was coming out of forward bends by rolling in an Iyengar class. And this is no disrespect to Iyengar's work, because I think he was a genius in what he did. And this person said, who have you been working with? Peter Blackaby.
Who's on the podcast
absolutely.
In a couple of weeks.
I remember I remember just almost frightened at the time, and as an adult, frightened of the yoga teacher, and I just know. But in the back of my mind, I thought, well, if this person's causing you this amount of upset, I want to find out who's
this guy. Yeah.
Anyway, about 6 months went by. I was in my shiatsu training at that time, and we had an anatomy day on one of the retreat weekends on the shiatsu course, and a guy came in to teach a day of postural anatomy. He was an osteopath, and he walked in, and it was Pete Blackaby. And the moment he walked in, even without the name, I knew who it was. It was quite strange, and I'd never forget seeing his face walk in the room. And we did this whole postural thing. I had hair, and we did this whole sort of postural thing and standing. I was one of the last ones to stand up, and I was a bit bigger than I'd done a lot of training, and there was a lot of people talking about that weight training is a bad thing for you, and it's bad for your body, and it makes you bad posture and stuff like that. And apparently, I stood up by this plumb line, and the room went quiet, and Pete came up to me afterwards. He said, "What is it you do?" And I sort of told him about my level of training, and he said, "It'd be interesting to talk to you." And he was talking about breath, gravity, and the spine in relation to yoga. Mm-hmm. The guy that started training me for bodybuilding competition was talking about breath, gravity, and spine in relation to weights. And the spinal element was coming up in my cycling years when I was younger.
It's funny, with enough quality, you'll find similar stuff anywhere, won't you?
Yeah, and it was
whatever they are.
3 key points in my life, a lot of years between them. And that was there. And we didn't stop talking. We'd arranged to meet. I went to a few of Pete's classes, and it was intriguing. He was still an Iyengar teacher and was coming away from his roots. Yeah. And I realized that the book that I'd been shown wasn't a Pilates book at all. It was the work that Pete was beginning to explore. And he was, I think, he was introduced by John Sturck and Mary Stewart towards the work. And it made complete sense to me from that moment on. And I thought, I get this straight away. It's common sense to the body, and it blended so well with me starting out as a fledgling personal trainer in those days as well. And I just thought, well, I'm working one-to-one with people, there's elements of this that will really benefit them for no other reason than just adding it to how they can train. But what I found, I was intrigued by the classes. I was definitely intrigued by Pete. And he had the understanding of looking at the body from a perspective that my father used to look at it from. And it just kind of brought me back to understanding structure from this left of field point of view. Because my dad was always this, don't take things as they are. Don't read the books and believe everything that you see. And don't let your brain tell you that you're too old to be someone involved in competition and sport. Now I say that, and here he is, he's an 80-year-old masters athlete, and he's just got gold in the European Championships at 200
he's running and doing hurdles.
My brother and I run with him. We can just about keep up with him. He does 150-meter sprints in reps.
I know Pete's very big on this, that, you go to his class, I'm the youngest one in the class at 37, and that you don't have to be decaying as you age. I think this would be a resonant theme for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And we've seen that with martial artists as well. I've been thrown around by enough 70-year-olds in Aikido to kind of have a real felt sense of that. It's not just a theoretical thing for me. So, what is yoga to you now? So the yoga scene has obviously changed a lot in the years you've been involved. You trained a whole load of the teachers, you and Pete, the teachers in Brighton. But, yoga since then has gone through something of a huge change, hasn't it? In terms of it got popular in the 90s, and then hot yoga's come, and, the Ashtanga kind of scene before hot. It's been through several waves of yoga. So the modern yoga scene is, let's say you're at the Yoga show with your table for your anatomy courses. It's pretty different now, isn't it?
Yeah, we had a stand at the second of every yoga show, actually, Natural Bodies, and it was a bit shocking to be in. Actually, it was a very busy environment. It was kind of good to be seen, put ourselves on the map in that way. Wasn't particularly comfortable with doing it like that. I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to say about this, but. It feels a certain way. It's changed, and I think this is just an evolution of it. There's definitely a Western yoga. Let's put it that way. One thing that happened when I was teaching at a British Real event once, I was teaching in their congress. I've taught them a few of the congresses, and they brought me in to teach some stuff around some of the anatomy that might relate to the yoga. And this woman came up to me at the end, and she was really excited, and she said, the anatomy is the new yoga. And I said, no, it's not at all. This is just about you understanding something that's going on with your structure, and it will help you as a teacher, but don't hang everything on that. What we did in our yoga teacher trainings, the guy will get anatomy from day one right the way through 3 years, but within that last year they taught to throw it all away. Yeah,
and anatomy has become more normal now for yoga teachers to study. And you said there's Western yoga. I think there's at least 2 Western yogas there, isn't there? There's the sort of consumer yoga, which is kind of painted in Eastern colors. And then I'd say what you're doing, or Pete's doing, is a true Western yoga in the sense that it's sort of scientifically orientated, it's anatomically and research kind of based as a foundation.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do, I can't speak for Pete anymore because I'm not in his classes. Pete's more a mate really now. And although I miss turning up in those classes as a student from way back. But I think we're taking that information and just making sense of it and then putting it into practice. So something that goes on with what I do is we kind of look at, there is this stuff that exists under the skin, but it's mapped out a certain way. It's got shape. It's not the fact that it's what you see in an anatomy book at all. It's nothing like that. But the shape gives you feel. And we've got feel all the way through, whether we know it or not. Some people just don't have much contact with that feel, and some people have almost too much contact with that feel. What's appropriate contact with that? And what I say to my groups is that all of this stuff you have, it's just that we can't see it. It's all under your skin. It's under clothing, but we feel it by braille. We're blind to it. And it's a braille process. And what information is that giving us? Originally some of the terminology around yoga was called the science of yoga. And even that would be coming out of some Indian traditions as well, and books that were put together that came out from India. It was called the science of yoga. That now their science is coming more from an Eastern perspective. We're kind of blending a little bit of the two, because I understand traditional Chinese medicine. It made more sense of my Indian philosophy.
What is yoga to you now then?
Mark, I've got no idea anymore, really. If I'm going to be completely honest. I have an experience with it. My personal practice has got an experience with it. And you know, I learned a lot from Diane Long as well. And I remember phoning her the first time, and she just said, "Are you lost, honey?" Like that, just, you know, lost with my work. And I just said, "Yeah." And she said, "Come on, get on a flight and come over to Florence." And that's what I did. And she just took it all apart, you know. And Diana said that Vanda Scaravelli took her practice away from her and just left her raw. And Diane slowly broke that down for me. And I would see Diane whenever I felt I need to, because she would leave me with a practice to go work with. And I still train. I still work with my practice. So that, you know, the Vanda's work is considered to be soft. It's not. There's a lot of depth in it, and it can be really quite hard.
And sometimes we're a little bit experiential on this podcast. I mean, if someone's walking or sitting or standing listening to this, you know, how would you lead them through an experience of something that we're talking about here, in terms of being aware of the internal anatomy, the experiential anatomy, embodied anatomy? I'm throwing this at you. I didn't, you know, prep this. I mean, you haven't had a chance to prep this, but how would that be, you know, someone listening to this? How could you explain what you mean in terms of an experience for them?
Well, if we're talking about what you just said, if that person's walking around and they're listening to this podcast, then the primary experience they're going to have is their feet on the ground. Their feet's likely to be in a shoe. But can the foot be wide enough to reach the edges of the shoe? Can the foot be long enough to reach the top and the toe end and the heel end of the shoe? So if they've just stopped for a moment and expand their feet within the shoe and notice where the rest of their body adapts to without trying to make sudden adjustments, it will kind of respond and try to take them towards more of a cleaner arrangement within gravity, so that the foot can help them do that. Of course, if they're in really high heels, I'm not so sure. But that's Brighton, isn't it? So anyway, but if the foot can stay long and wide, then there's going to be a change somewhere up the chain. And maybe that might have an effect on the quality of their breath. So some people tend to notice that just by organizing the foot that way, the body starts to rearrange itself a little differently within the field of gravity. That can take, I'm not saying it does, it can take a little bit of pressure off the breath. And they often find their breath's a bit deeper. That is a great starting point. And in fact, that's a starting point, and it's an advanced point, and it keeps coming back. And I've always ever worked with it, and it's still there 30 years on. That's where I'll go.
Nice. And you know, for me, that's often a little practice I'll do, just walking around or standing in a line or sitting on the subway, you know, on the underground yesterday. And it's just allowing my foot to expand slightly, you know, allowing the width and the length. And I know you've done this in lessons with me. You've sort of pulled my foot and allowed that to happen. And at the time I'm going, what's he doing? Nothing's happening. And then later on I realized, like, and it's significant enough that my toes will actually then touch the end of my shoe. So it's, you know, there's really some movement. Yeah. And then, as you say, your view of anatomy, as I understand it, is that it's all connected. So, and we'll talk about fascia, I guess, in this section, in that, you know, an anatomy textbook might have the bone system or the breathing or the muscular system or, you know, the nervous system as sort of separate things that have been cut out, you know, and there's separate parts. Like even we have a word for foot. You know, in Ethiopia, there's no word for foot. They just have the word for leg, and the leg goes right down to the leg fingers, which are the toes.
Perfect.
Yeah, they have the same word for the whole thing, so they wouldn't have a separate word for the foot. So we you know, have a sense of things being separate, but they're not, right? So maybe speak to that. How are they not separate?
Well, first of all, we can make them separate, and the only reason we make them separate is by cutting them up. There's a friend of mine, colleague, guy called Gil Headley, and he has had a quote that says, our vision of the body is determining our behavior towards it. So because there's this learning about a foot being a separate entity, people then have the foot rather than my foot. You know, so this foot, when often if I've got someone coming in and I'm treating them, they've got an injury with their foot, it's this foot. You know, there's almost a relationship.
So it's an objectified view of the body.
But it's been learned that way. It's been taught as parts. Now, there's two sides to this, really, because it's very difficult to understand holistic anatomy. Because it's like, that's a bit like me saying, right, learn all your anatomy right now. Here it is in this one moment.
So you kind of have to break things down to look at them.
You've got to break things down to look at them.
You know, it's artificial. Let's call that a foot. Okay, how does it work? Yeah,
we're not mechanical. It's been tried to people have tried to understand it in a mechanical way. That's purely because the brains of that particular time could only look at it in mechanics. You know, we've got Leonardo da Vinci that did stuff like that. However, he was a genius guy. He understood In fact, if Leonardo da Vinci's work had been his anatomical research had been put together as a medical treatise, I wouldn't be sitting here. Pete Blackaby wouldn't be sitting here having those conversations. Tom Myers wouldn't have done what he did, because it all would have been covered a long time ago. Because his work was seen as doodles and art.
Right.
He discovered how the heart worked before they discovered how the heart worked.
Yeah. You see that in his anatomy sketches are crazy good.
And they start to look a little bit more integrated. He's looked at whole kind of structures. But of course, to try and understand it, people have broken it down and broken it down and broken it down. Now, thank God for that, because also medical anatomy saves lives.
Yeah.
If there's some heart condition going on, you want someone that works with hearts a lot to work with your heart. You don't want a knee specialist to start doing some work on your heart.
But this is the joy, the wonder of specialization, which really was the root of civilization. It was we only had the civilized city-state when someone said, okay, you take care of the food, I'll take care of the writing, I'll take care of the government, I'll take care of the, whatever. And we specialize, and that specialization journey has increased since the Babylonians to the kind of modern day, where we become very, very specialists. And as you say, that's wonderful that someone knows so much about the heart when they're doing a heart operation. But they're not seeing the bigger picture. I mean, what about the view that generally that, the body is just a set of sort of pulleys and levers, and, the bicep contracts and then the forearm goes up, this kind of mechanistic
it's a perception, and if I treat it that way, I'll get that result. But I don't know. I often do this with my group. Is like, if I had a cup of coffee in my hand and I did the bicep like it's this lever system thing, then all I'm going to do is slam the coffee into my face. There's a refinement has to go on, and the entire body's got to get involved in moving that cup towards my mouth. The bicep just so happens to be a longer chain of networks that makes that happen. Now, of course, if I'm training a certain way, I bring much more attention to that region to bring the effort to it. However, the rest of the body has to be just as attentive to balance it. So that you zero the focus in. But no, pulleys and levers, maybe to have Joe Average understand it sometimes, but that's
GCSE level.
Yeah, maybe, but this is a really interesting thing as well. As I was teaching to Middlesex University to the dance science degree students, and I had about 4 years teaching. And year 2, I came in on year 2. So year 1, they got basic anatomy. And I'd see some of these guys move sometimes, and when they were coming at the very beginning, I'd see the earlier ones move, and they move quite fluidly. Then they learn their basic anatomy. Like robots.
Became a little bit stiffer.
A bit more robotic. So they could take on the concepts. They get me year 2, literally. The following year, they get this stuff. So we turn the anatomy upside down, throw it up in the air, and starts to see how it lands. And they weren't wedded to the old ideas. They could gel the two, and they did it beautifully. And then their movement patterns were something else afterwards.
And as you say, maybe there's levels of understanding. And this is the same in any science, that you learn something and then you go, oh, that's right. And then you go to, say, from school level to high school level and they say, well, actually, that's wrong. But this is another way of looking at it. The next level, university, is like that. Well, that's wrong. Here's another way. And it gets more and more complex. And these different levels can have, can be useful in a certain way up to a certain point. But, I've been in workshops with you and other people where I've just learned something about my body. And all of a sudden, my whole, when I learned how thick the spine was, I thought the spine was kind of maybe as thick as, I don't know, a carrot or something, a thin banana, and then I learned that actually, how thick is the spine? You can tell better than, I don't know.
Once you start to get down to the lumbar vertebra, you get those sticky outy bits at the sides called transverse processes. You've got quite a few inches across from one point to another.
It's taking up half the torso, isn't it?
It's taking up a lot of space, and of course, there's a lot that blends to it and comes from it and what have you. But, it's
just
a
knowing
deep structure. Once you know that, if you can get a feel for where that is.
So there's a subjective knowing as well as a sort of cognitive knowing.
It's not the thing that you can touch at the back of your body. They're just little sticky outy bits that are covered in an enormous amount of tissue.
And then it's like, wow, I'm much more solid than I thought. And actually, there's a way in which, you see sort of martial arts movements, people are breaking people's backs over their knees and things, completely ludicrous. And it's, that actually changes my felt sense of myself, like how I am in my system. Or I remember you told me once, the skull is kind of and just another vertebrae. It's part of the spine. It's not a thing on top of the spine. It's just a
continuation of the spine.
And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Again, my then field changes, and that is changing my psychology, my emotions, my social relationships. So you've just told me a little anatomical fact, and I've kind of had an experience of that. And all of a sudden, my world's shifting across multiple domains.
And, we're dealing with a different language. I've always struggled with this from day one, is how do we find a language that describes these sensations and describes maybe, let's say, the word anatomy, for want of a better word, but anatomy means that we break it into pieces. Here we're trying to find a language of everything together. So we're almost struggling for the language. At the moment there's a slight change in language, you'd get a different sense of yourself.
Yeah.
You go take that away and do whatever you do with it. But for some people, it's like they remember it, and you've remembered it. It's worked.
Yeah. There's a few things that really stuck with me from some of the workshops we've done. And and that it feels different. I'm put together, and I'm moving different. Then I'm interacting with my wife differently. There's the knock-on effect of all those things. And we've cut up a dead body together once, didn't we, Gary? I should say, for the record, it was legal.
It was legal
in a hospital, and most yoga teachers have never actually done a dissection. It's for most of the people on that course that weekend, I remember it was a first for most of us. And it's a profound experience for me. It was an existential death meditation, to hold a human heart in my hands.
I was thinking about that on the way here, actually.
And so it stuck with me as an experience, but also anatomically, body, like when you cut up a body, you don't see this neat bone system or this neat muscular system. Like on the wall behind you there's a skeletal system diagram, and the bones are outlined and it's all very neat. It's not like that. It's a mess. And one thing, the skin goes into the fascia goes into the muscle. There's all these continuities that are artificially cut. Say a little bit about that. To create the kind of books and the images that we tend to see on that chart, and most of the anatomy books that we tend to see around, is it's all been divided up and cut. So my colleague Julian Baker, who these are his labs basically, he leads them, and I'm lucky enough to sort of come in with Julian and do that, and we lead some dissections together. Is that one thing that he will say, and Gil Headley and Todd Garcia, who I've worked with will both say that the moment you start to take a blade to the skin, you are destroying the continuity. So we are creating anatomy through a process of destruction. And you're actually, I've seen the skill it takes. Because, I was just clumsily kind of hacking away kind of thing, despite your best efforts to teach me. And the skill that it takes to cut those lines, it's almost like you're creating, in some cases, it's like, well, would that be there if it wasn't for the fact that you just cut that outline?
No, not that way. I mean, Robert Schleip, who's a lead fascial researcher, was in the lab with Julian and I once, and he wanted to see something called the nuchal ligament, which is outlined there at the base of the skull, that ligamentous material there. And
this one here.
And Julian said, I can make you one of those. And Robert said, what do you mean make me one? He said, well, I can make you an Eiffel Tower out of it if you want. Purely because by taking a blade to it, you've got to cut it away. It doesn't exist as a separate entity. These things literally have been created by a blade.
So it's not like there's a white ligament in there and you just kind of cut this irrelevant fascial stuff around it. We'll come to that maybe next. And it's actually, you have to sculpt it. And some of the things we see on an anatomy textbook, you just don't find in the body. As this form that's just there waiting for you to somehow discover it, like the Western explorer in Africa,
my first ever dissection that I ever did was in Vienna at the Institute of Anatomy, and I think it was the best learning I had at the beginning, and it was a fabulous place to learn. And I always was used to using scalpels through my years of graphics. For about 12 years, I had a scalpel in hand every day, so I'm good with scalpels. And I was priding myself on how I could do that, but I was a bit clumsy when I get with the body. And I just went about doing the work on the leg, and I got quite interested by that. And I just created an anatomical leg, and I was excited that I'd done it. And I pulled the guy over, Todd, and I said, look at this, and he said, well, that just shows me, the anatomy is. He said, now let your hands do the work. Create something different. And that, I just sat back and thought, oh my God, I don't know a thing. I don't know a thing. I thought I knew loads, and it's just all fallen apart in front of me. And I just started looking at this body in the same way as looking at the statue of David from upside down, from a totally different perspective. And I think I was just hands off for the rest of that day, and we had another 6 days to go. And I just thought, what am I going to, this is a blank canvas. What do I do now? What am I looking for? What's my project? And then I got it. And I thought, if I was a bone, what would be my landscape? What would I see from that perspective? And then I started to get this map from the other way around. And I just thought, well, we're taking this thing apart anyway. It's an insult not to. and let's just use it all up. Let's go. And I just created something different. And then my projects, which have been going on for over 10 years now, started to evolve from there. And yeah, it's a very different thing. You know, Gunther von Hagens has done something quite genius, is that he's taken the body apart as many ways as you can take it apart.
Yeah.
And there's probably another 100 ways to go.
So he's the artist that does the plastifier.
Yeah, Bodywork it's called.
Yeah,
and originally it was called Anatomy Art. So the very first one that came to Brick Lane was, they had to call it Bodywork because they changed it from Anatomy Art because there was a big uproar. How can you call that art when you cut up a body? Doing the dissection where he started to realize exactly what he had to do.
Yeah.
And we managed to hire it for two hours and take my first ever teach training group there.
Wow.
No, second ever teach training group there. And we managed to get them around to have a look at that. So that was their time in a lab, as it were. But he's taken it apart in every way you can to display it, different to what the anatomy books show you. But he cannot take it apart the way it went together.
Mm-hmm.
One cell, sperm and egg, and then it starts to evolve. So he can't take it apart that way.
Yeah.
You know, he just takes apart what he's dealing with.
Yeah.
It's nothing like an anatomy book will show you at all.
You're known as being a fascialist. Is that the word? A fascist, a fascialist?
I don't know. There's fashion artists. I don't know.
It's become very fashionable now to be a fascist.
It is.
We're not talking about the Donald Trump kind, but the fascia is sort of a bit of a buzzword. It's something that people seem quite kind of crazy obsessed with in yoga land right now.
A bit too much.
Yeah, it's kind of gone through a process, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, let's just start at the beginning. What is fascia for people that don't know what that is?
Oh God, it goes under a different term as called connective tissue. Also, it's a connecting medium. It's these membranes that shape and contain your muscular structures that then blend towards your tendons, blend towards the bone. It's the skin that makes the bone. It's the stuff that organizes every single part of you, really.
So in a way, it's a continuity through the whole body.
It's a continuity. Right? If you were to disappear all of your body tissue and leave your connective tissue behind, very simply what I say is you'd end up looking like a loofah shaped like you.
Yeah, so a loofah is one of the bath things. Yeah. But you still would look like you. That's interesting.
Oh yeah,
so
that would be your shape.
Like you. A muscular system doesn't look like you.
No, your skeleton is uniquely yours.
Yeah.
Every structure is uniquely yours. There is no one anatomy. All of us are 100% perfect specimens of anatomy.
And people are quite different, aren't they? I've seen yoga teachers say, look, because of the rotation of the thigh, there's no way you're going to do that posture, or because of the length of your arms, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to do a headstand. I know you disagree with this to some extent, but there's also anatomy, like, people have organs on the other side.
Yeah.
It's surprisingly common to have, say, the liver on the left and not on the right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a fairly big difference. We're not all the textbook.
Yeah, I mean, when there is this situus reversus or something, I've got the name probably completely wrong, but I actually haven't come across anyone that has that, but I've seen examples of it, and I've seen a real life example of that in a lab, and it's quite intriguing. That person functions. It's just that everything's the other way around.
Yeah, and we are different shapes, right? I mean, different sizes. We're different. Daria was looking at my forearm the other day and saying, "Oh, mine's half the size of yours."
Yeah, it's good forearm.
Well, thank you very much.
Manly forearm.
Thank you, dear. It's always nice to flirt with you. And she was saying, "Well, you're quite different from me physically," and we were just, man, woman, but also just different sizes, anatomy, and different training there too. But we were just going, "Oh, that's really actually quite interesting that human beings come in quite different shapes."
Yeah. So how do we organize a practice that is relevant to the individual? And this is something that Vanda was doing, because she never taught classes. She taught people privately. So again, Diane Long, who spent the longest time studying with Vanda, is as tall as my wife Sharon, and got long legs, and so is Sharon. And she's also taught John Sturck, who is about my height and a completely different setup. Yeah. So you watch John move and you watch Diane move, two totally different ways of moving, and yet there's something similar in how they're approaching it and the quality. But the way that those two people were taught, same as Sophie Hoare and Mary Stewart and such, they were all taught relative to them and what was required at the time.
And as I understand it, all yoga was taught one-to-one until the 60s, right? It was Iyengar that invented group classes.
No, there is a lot of talk that the group classes thing came about from him in terms of him teaching the Indian Army.
Yeah.
However, there are other schools that have taught large groups in their situations as well. I just think that was just a way to get that to larger people. But
the norm was 1-to-1.
But the norm was 1-to-1 if we start to go way back, and then maybe 2-to-1, 3-to-1, stuff like that. That's easy. I can do that. If I'm working with 3 or 4-to-1, I can still work it relative to the person's needs. But we can, with this work, I think the skill in being a teacher around this work is to have a group class and then take that work and they all get it as a 1-to-1 thing for each one of them.
Yeah, I remember was in your class the other day, and there's 5 or 6 of us in your little studio lunchtime class, and we're all different ages. There's someone that just started yoga. There's people that have been doing it 40 years there with different bodies, in different states, and you're teaching a theme, but everyone's doing something slightly different. Everyone's got the, it's not dictated. There's room to explore. And, you'll be losing the fascial images. I remember you doing that like a stretch where it's like, imagine you're kind of putting your hand into a long glove. So you're using these beautiful imageries to kind of, from your anatomy background, to help people understand mentally. And you're walking around doing little bits of body work with people as in the group, and you're touching everyone differently. Yeah. So this is a nice sort of blended approach, isn't it? It's very individualized, but simultaneously you're still teaching a group. There's a theme. We're all basically lying on our back and working with our hamstrings or whatever it is.
Yeah. So I mean, it's. I think bringing the anatomy to it is that the anatomy gives a very different experience as to what we're teaching and how we're teaching it, and just knowing how it moves. Funny enough, I mean, there's a lot of criticism out there with people that say, "Well, how can you learn about a moving body by cutting up a dead one?" Yeah, and of course that's the case. I mean, that's just blatantly obvious. But there's a lot of criticism around that. In fact, there's a quote from Van der Scaravelli that says, "It goes going with the body and not against it." This is what the practice is about. And those words came thundering back to me the moment I started to peel the muscular linings away from bone, because what I saw was an amazing myriad of shape that is unusual. It's not usually seen, because we're looking at how every single muscle form shapes itself against the next, and they've got structure, shape, and they're 3D, and they all move a particular way. So they all move relative to their form around the bony structure, and the bone moves with that. And if I go with that, I've got freedom of movement. And it led me to go practice. So after I was spending a day in Vienna dissecting up the leg to the pelvis, my brain was overflowing with all this information that I understood. I was then on the floor in the hotel room, rolling around trying to figure out those movements without trying to think, well, there's an origin here and an insertion there and it's called a quadriceps. That's bollocks. Yeah. It's something completely different.
And there's a kind of spiral quality to a lot of the anatomy in the body. It's not really straight lines in the body. Even things that look straight, like a femur, they're not really straight. There's a curve, and you as you're cutting up the body, you sort of see these ways they kind of curl around each other like vines.
Yeah, and you let your hand follow the shape, and it almost sucks your hand in. It's remarkable, and you just that you learn so much.
And we see this in martial arts as well. Like you've done some Wing Chun, haven't you? Yeah. And there's this, these kind of curves and spirals that people move with, the kind of sticky hands kind of work.
Yeah, my Sifu, Kevin Lee, who's down in Brighton. I mean, he's now must be in his mid-80s, and he's again another one of those sort of older martial artists that you just cannot touch, and there's nothing of him. He's your typical, sort of Chinese business-looking man, and he's got his walking stick and he walks down the street. But the moment you're in front of him and working with him, this guy comes alive, and it's like working against steel. And there's nothing of it. It's quite incredible, and I learned so much more about my yoga practice by working with him in Wing Chun. Now, I did Wing Chun a long time ago with a bunch of 30-year-old guys that were quite macho around it, and I was a teenager and stuff, and they just wanted to beat the hell out of the students, and so eventually that just disappeared. But meeting this guy a long time ago, he just took everything away and took it back to basic structure, but gravity and how things spiral into form. And I thought, there it all is. And he just said, your structure stays with you everywhere you go. It's like, with your Aikido, that skill and this external series of places that you put your body will always ever be there, because that distance will never change. And I just, all of a sudden, my yoga practice changed again.
Okay, so your yoga practice does have this kind of spiraling kind of quality quite often, not so much linear. I see that becoming more popular now, kind of the movement people are, it's a big deal now in yoga, the kind of movement world, and there's is it the axis syllabus, and there's like a whole bunch of people now working with movement, working with spirals rather than just the rectangular prison, as we sometimes call it, of the mat, right? This little rectangle that you don't have mats in your main studio now, right? We're just all on the carpet together. Yeah, anything more?
Yeah, I mean, the mat thing I've always seen as a kind of a restricting structure. And the fact that we do roll is just, you've got that picture on there of the baby squatting. But, you watch how a baby starts to move, and you see that Feldenkrais did a lot of this, and Pete Blackaby was influenced that way from Sabine as well, is that, that these rolling patterns that we start to see is that you've kind of got shapes that you roll into, and they kind of take you to the next place. And all of a sudden you can see that a lot of I don't even like the word posture in yoga because it signifies something solid.
That's a thick, fixed thing.
I call it a gesture.
Yeah.
Those gestures move from one place to the next. And then we could take them into something that might be absolutely classical, because I say this a lot, and I do stand by this, is that those classical practices and postures have been around a lot longer than some of this new stuff.
Yeah.
Vander's work is relatively new in the world of yoga, and it's a nice progression. Some of the other things are nice progressions. We're standing on the shoulders of stuff that has been around for a few thousand years.
Is that the case though, really, Gary? I mean, isn't there sort of books saying that a lot of the postural yoga is really only 100 years old, 200 years old?
No, I disagree. But I do think that they blended and mixed the ideas, because we know that some of these warrior type postures, when you watch them, they've come straight out of martial arts.
Yeah, or gymnastics. I've heard from Scandinavia.
They've been put together.
All sorts of influences there, yeah.
So, if you start to see a flowing form, you can see there's that lovely footage of Iyengar in 1938 going through his practices. It must have been his 20s, and he's not on a yoga mat, it's on a rug. No one came up with a rubber yoga mat in those days. It's a rug, and he's going across it and along it and around it, and everything's just blending from one place to the next. And if he feels like he just needs to hang out there for a moment, he'll stay there.
Yeah.
Then you've got a pose,
and then someone takes a picture of it. Exactly. Especially pictures were kind of, especially in those days, you couldn't just take a digital and do 1,000 pictures.
Exactly.
So it'd be like, all right, stop, there's a picture, that's a pose, as opposed to seeing it as a flow.
Yeah,
seeing it as a movement.
It definitely links and flows from one thing to the next, and it's almost like let's consider it, it's another Tai Chi. But a lot of people have missed the bits that intersect from that said posture to that said posture. What about the bit that joins them?
Yeah.
That's a pose in itself.
Yeah.
So can we blend the gestures?
And also that's how you're conditioning your body, right? I mean, even if you did, in inverted commas, perfect poses, if you were doing shitty, unpleasant, unfunctional body movement between those poses, that's how you're training yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
For the majority of that class.
Yeah. So, if people are trying to get into a squat, let's say, for instance, and all they're doing is just collapsing the arches of their feet and their knees dropping, but at least they got their heels on the floor, because getting the heels on the floor is the gold medal. Then all they're learning is that eventually they're going to give themselves dropped arches.
Yeah.
That's a possible route that they could go down, and it's not necessarily that useful for their functionality. They might start complaining of knee issues, hip issues, low back issues, or just a problem at the foot.
Yeah.
Who knows? And we could see that it just starts at that point. I see that. I definitely see that around the world in all my years of teaching, is that this desperation to get the heels on the floor in dog pose at the cost of the arch of the foot.
Yeah.
And then we see all sorts of imbalances that can occur from that. And just by making a simple change there, and learning about the reasons why that could possibly not be so useful, is enough for someone to make a big change in the rest of their practice life.
And that's just one example of there's a picture that it's supposed to look a set way, and doing whatever end gaining, the Alexander technique people would call it, to get to that perfect shape that they have in their mind as a picture, or maybe even the teacher's telling them. And there's a real non-attachment practice in it, I find, in yoga, isn't there, of going, oh, I'm a bit stiff today, or I'm recovering from an injury, or I'm just the way my body's shaped, internal femur rotation is kind of difficult for me, and just going, all right, well, I don't look like that. And even if someone's done quite a bit of practice over the years, I still notice that urge to sort of jump on the perfect picture. And that in itself, for me, is a practice, is kind of letting go of that and treating myself as a human being and actually being present to how I am today rather than the picture.
Yeah, and I if I kind of just jump back into my bodybuilding years and sculpting and stuff like that, some people might want to do something with their bodies and put themselves in those positions, but there's elements of our body that are adaptable to go do that. That, my body shape won't go and do what Diane Longley does. Yeah. No matter whatever she tries to do, there'll be an element in the way that I move that might shift that way, but I will not be her. I'm me. Yeah. But I do know that given the confines of my structure and maybe the limits or expansion abilities of my brain, is that I can shape my body a certain way by sculpting it, training it, moving it, dealing with an environment, changing the diet, I know it's adaptable to that. I've been through that, and I know it can do it. It's just whether I want to.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We talk about sculpture throughout, you know, the idea of sculpting with a scalpel anatomy, the idea of sculpting bodybuilding, the idea of the sort of, you know, working in Florence with Diane Longley, but also seeing the sculptures there. Yeah. You know, it's interesting, like when to sculpt, when to impose will, when to, you know, form yourself a certain way, and that we can do that. That's one of the beauties of being a human with the education we have, is we can sculpt ourselves. And then obviously if that goes too far, it becomes a kind of tyranny. You know, I have to be a certain way, and, you know, forcing myself, not listening to the body, not going with the natural anatomy and the spirals or whatever it is. And, you know, if that goes too far, it's just purely going with the flow. It's like, well, what's the point of all that knowledge? What are we actually creating? Yeah. There isn't anything really being created there.
I think it's more of a destruction. It's very easy for our structure to destroy itself, and it becomes a slow motion destruction. Well, some people it's quite quick. It's easy to drop into habit, you know, the habits that might break our structure down. You know, just sitting in chairs, working at desks and computers is a habit that we, you know, some people are driven by the habit out of the need to earn money because they've got bills to pay and a house to, you know, and a family, all that kind of stuff. So that's the only way they know to do it. We're in a rarefied environment. Not everyone does this.
Sure. We're free to do. Very lucky.
We're lucky, but we haven't chosen the easy route to do it. We're not a slave to it, because it's a passion behind it. But some people, their body will be sculpted to their job, and then they'll leave the job at the end of the day. And if they've been sitting in a chair, I often say this, and it's just a general analogy, they'll get on a train, sit in the train, then get to the car, sit in the car, get home, sit on the sofa.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk of sitting as the new smoking and the standing desks.
Yeah, I mean, everyone considers that we've kind of evolved being upright. We haven't. We're still on all fours, but we're just doing it this way up. This is still an all fours position. Does that make sense?
No.
Yeah? This is all fours.
Okay. Oh, I see. So that the sitting is an all fours position. Yeah.
All I've done is taking the all fours that way.
Yeah. So if you listen to the podcast, Gary's putting his hands up as if on a computer, and it's very similar to being on an all fours position, but rotated through 90 degrees.
Exactly. And that's all it is. So that the patterning is pretty much the same. It's just that there's much more compressive forces going on in the structure. And some people are stuck with that posture throughout the day. You know, you just have to, you notice, you walk through London, there's a lot more glass buildings in London than there ever used to be, and you see a lot of people sitting at desks. I have seen people, though, sitting at or standing.
Yeah, they're getting more normal now.
More standing.
Personally, if I do more than 2 or 3 days admin in the office, I feel terrible.
Yeah,
you know, for me, it's like that yoga class in the evening becomes a matter of just feeling well. Yeah. And I certainly feel better when I've spent 3 days teaching a workshop, standing up, talking for most of the time.
Yeah, even though that can be tiring. I mean, there's an energy for that.
Yeah.
And, you know, people are on the floor, you can get them moving. And this is something I say to my groups, even though some of my course material is a lot of content. So even though they're coming to a movement-based thing, there's going to be a lot of sitting, listening for a while, but take care of yourself, move around. Now, I'm not going to take offense if you start getting up and walking about, because I'm not going to see that as you being bored. I'm giving you permission to take responsibility for your structure and how you feel in that moment. Because sometimes that feeling will affect your learning.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're listening through our embodiment.
Yes.
So everyone listening to this podcast, this another little exercise for people, whether you're standing, walking, sitting, driving, the structure you're in is impacting how the words Gary and I are saying are landing. And you don't have to believe us in that. I mean, just shift into a significantly different standing or sitting or walking mode, different position, and then notice for the last kind of, 5 minutes of the podcast, does it land differently? Do you feel more open to the ideas that Gary's suggesting? Do you feel less open? Do you feel warmer towards us or more antagonistic? I know when I'm sitting in a certain way, everyone else is fucking wrong. And when I'm sitting in another way, I'm like, wow, what an interesting idea. Maybe I disagree, but it's fascinating. Yeah. And, our listening is informed.
A simple example is you cross your arms. Uh-huh. Yeah. And you've got your groove in the way that you cross your arms. You change the cross of the arm. It just doesn't sit right. And after a while, you can't hear. You'll end up going back to your own one.
Yeah, it's a really nice one for exploring habits. To either cross your arms or put your fingers together, and one index finger will be on top. Yeah. And then change. You can try this listening to this, and then try with the other index finger on top, and all crossing the arms the other way. I've done this so much in workshops now because I use this as an example of how habit can become a tyranny, even when it's not there's no reason that or that is more functional.
No, exactly.
It's, it's not like you've broken your arms. It has to be that way. And it's a really good example because people would say, right, try for the rest of the day to cross your arms the other way. And nobody manages it for a day because at some point you start paying attention to something else. And then
if you had to make a really important decision with the opposite cross of the arms, you would slip to the other side.
Interesting.
Here you can't do it.
Interesting.
It's disturbed.
Uh-huh.
It's a neural pathway. It's a pattern that we put into the body. This is a disturbing process because everything's agitated. And so eventually, we've got some normality to the two.
Yeah. Having done it for 10 years in workshops as a little demo, now I can do it and it doesn't seem. But the first time people do it, they actually make noises. They go, "Whoa!"
Yeah.
Whoa.
So there it is. And that's almost an expression of them. They've embodied the expression of what the arms are telling them. In that way.
And then when you go on to think, okay, the arms one is a relatively insignificant one compared to certain other ways we stand, breathe, walk, and actually that's patterning our whole system the entire time in a way that we're invisible to, in the same way as you don't feel the arms cross one way, but you do feel across the other. There's an invisible conditioning happening the whole time.
I see this every time I go to Brazil with Sharon.
What do you see in Brazil?
My wife's Brazilian. She's born in Rio. So she's got a
just for the listeners, she's exactly how you might imagine a beautiful Brazilian woman looking.
But blonde and white and very tall. But Sharon, when we get to Brazil, she moves differently.
She shifts in that cultural.
She shifts into that. She's back home. So her skin changes, her hair changes, but her movement pattern is completely different.
I feel sexier as soon as I go to Brazil.
Absolutely.
I've worked there for a while and I start moving differently. I got back from Brazil. My mother said, "Where did you get those hips from?" Because I was like slinking my way
Brazil,
in. I was like, "Hey, mom,"
and it really is. And that way of moving actually creates a behavior, and that behavior starts to come up as a lightness. Even though there's a lot of heavy stuff that goes on in Brazil, but it's almost, to some degree, it's kind of countered almost equally by that way of living.
Let's party, let's have a good time, let's dance, let's have some good food.
Big smiles, everyone's laughing. And I tell you what, wherever we go, Sharon detects a Brazilian wherever she is in the world. And the moment she detects them, they're in conversation and they're happy. As if they've met 100 times over. It's the first time.
Well, the joy is the antidote, I think, for a lot of the trauma and difficulty there. And sadness is the emotion that people I knew in Brazil struggled with, actually, because they were stuck in joy almost. Whereas, that was it's like, don't bring the party down, because then we'll have to acknowledge how difficult life is.
Well, she's sort of half English, half Brazilian, so at least she's got the English side. She can still moan, but not as much as me. But
we're talking about cultural bodies with Vilja. If you haven't listened to the episode from Alexander Voskaya on cultural bodies, we had a good conversation about Russian versus English, Irish, and American cultural bodies. Lastly, fight or flight. So this is something else I know that you work with, people being stuck in that fight-flight body. How does that relate to how we do our yoga, how we live? This is a common theme. I covered it when I did a podcast on centering, for example. I know this is something you talk about a lot and incorporate into your yoga.
Yeah, I do. I think it's come about just from the environment that I see around me, and especially, I'm spending a lot more time in London now as well. And I've worked in London a lot, but from around the world, is that there's this sort of high charge that's going on. And a lot of yoga practices tend to kind of do that. So, and you've mentioned this before, is that, we'll get high stress people go into a high stress yoga class.
Yeah, because it feels right.
Yeah, it feels right. So all that's happening is they're being cranked back up to that same place again. Yeah. So it might be necessary in their work life to actually maintain the feed, because often by the time they get to the afternoon, they go into that 3 o'clock lull.
Yeah, and if they're addicted to that kind of hit of adrenaline that you get from fight or flight. And I've noticed those people, when they come to a countryside retreat that I've run, it takes them about a day, and then they're exhausted. And they might spend 2, maybe 3 days just barely functional. And I can see why they wouldn't want to be like that.
So, for me, it's that, can we start to move into a practice that takes you into challenging places, but you meet it in a calm way?
Yeah.
So that, I used to race cars when I was much younger as well. And, that's a stress. And it's exciting and it's stressful at the same time, because one wrong move and there's a life or death moment.
Yeah.
So you've got to be absolutely clear and calm, and the mind has to be still. The brain's got to be still to take in the environment around you whilst you're moving this object at high speed and sideways. So, if you can stay calm in environments, that might be stressful, it actually gives you a greater opportunity to survive the environment, not have the internal stresses and the damage effects of that on the body, but then how you might manage the outcome.
So you're actually happier subjectively, but your relationships are going to be better. I think that's the other piece there.
Yeah.
But also objectively, you're going to be not crashing that car so easily. Whether that's crashing your life
crashing
or your bank account. And I think modern posture yoga is fantastic for that, isn't it? Pete Blackaby, I was in his class Thursday, he was talking about creeping up on the posture as if your breath didn't notice that you'd gone into plank pose.
That's right.
Yeah. And you do this similar thing. And it's a great place to practice not engaging that fight or flight while doing something a bit tricky, but not something that's going to have a huge consequence for your life. It doesn't really matter if I'm in your class and my plank pose isn't perfect. I don't lose my wife or my house or my job,
Exactly.
So it's a nice place to practice not going into that mode.
Yeah, and I think noticing the moment you're about to.
Yeah.
So you can recognize the effect of it on yourself. Because then out there in the world, when those moments come up, we don't get it. I definitely don't get it right all the time. Sharon would attest to that as well. Is that there's moments where we can start to recognize the similarity of that feeling where I'm moving into stress, and then can I do something about that?
Yeah, so spotting it, and sometimes we spot it sooner or earlier. Yeah.
Is it going to be useful for me?
Yeah.
There might be moments where we absolutely need to use it, but the thing with fight or flight is something that the body can animals will do that. They'll go straight to it and then they'll dissipate the charge. What I say, we don't dissipate the charge, and when we do, it comes out at the wrong time. So to wrap up here, well, not you're going to wrap up, but this will relate to what you know as well. And I've taught at prisons and psychiatric units as well. And when I was working with this woman who was running this department in the psychiatric unit, we went to her place to go through how it would work. And she was making some coffee. I went to the fridge to get some milk, and on the fridge was a fridge magnet. And it said to be angry at the right person for the right thing, for the right amount at the right time is an art form.
Wow. Yeah, so not to discount
there
that.
It is.
But I saw someone screaming at his, I think, partner as he left the house the other day in Brighton, just screaming at her. And I thought, even when I'm in a bad mood with Daria, I stop it before it gets that far. It's never gone that far.
Yeah.
And the second thing I thought was, that's not in his best interests. I mean, forget about the poor person he was shouting at, it was abusive kind of language, but it was also, he's going to regret that later. And that is not the choice he would make had he had the body awareness and the skills to inhibit that earlier on.
And I've been there. I've been in those situations and I've not been proud of the way that I've behaved in my life in those situations, definitely. And, as I was chatting with someone that is kind of legally based and, when something had happened, he looked at me and he just said, that was disrespectful. And I thought, oh God, what was it? Really was disrespectful to this other person. He said, no, it's disrespectful to yourself. And he changed my entire vision on how I treat myself. And that was really quite remarkable.
Interesting.
Because it was, it's about, most of the time I'll beat myself up about stuff and that expands itself out. And that's not the way. It was me, I had to really understand me in that moment and the effect it was going to have on me.
Nice. I think we do need to wrap this up, Gary.
That's cool.
I could speak for you all day with you all day. This is some great stuff, and really enjoyed it. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the aesthetics to the anatomy to cutting up dead bodies to Florentine sculpture to yoga.
Holding hearts in your hands.
Holding hearts. That I highly recommend. If you've never done a dissection, for anyone who works with the body, it really is a profound experience, both educationally and also sort of existentially. I highly recommend it, especially in cultures where death is hidden away. I highly recommend Gary's anatomy courses. Obviously, if you're local in Brighton, you can come to his yoga classes. Where can people find out more about Gary?
The best thing to do is to come to naturalbodies.co.uk. And then, we've pretty much got everything on there, the layout of the courses that are run around the country. They're 10 months long.
It's yoga holidays, the longer anatomy courses you run in Scotland and the UK, and England.
London. We're going to be Bath. We're in Scotland at the moment, Leeds. And then we're looking to Sweden as well with that. And then, I do a yoga kind of retreat holiday with Sharon. She teaches on it as well, in Turkey every October. So we've got one coming up soon.
Great.
And that's it. It's all there.
Beautiful, man.
Thank you.
Pleasure as ever. So give me a hug.
That's the sound of a hug. That's the sound of a hug for those of you on the podcast.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.